The mop handle felt awkward in his hands, and the faint smell of bleach clung to his borrowed uniform. Matthew Carter, CEO of a successful mid-sized cleaning services company, had built his business from the ground up. But lately, reports of high turnover, employee dissatisfaction, and slipping service quality had been piling up. He couldn't trust second-hand reports any more. He needed to see for himself. With his graying hair dyed a dull brown, a pair of thick-rimmed glasses, and a slight limp added to his gait, he was unrecognizable. No one in his corporate chain of 12 locations had ever met him in person, except for a few upper managers. He arrived at one of his cleaning service branches, a contract team responsible for maintaining offices and commercial spaces. The manager, a heavy-set man named Greg, barely glanced at him as he handed over a uniform. "New guy, huh, name," Greg muttered, shuffling papers on his desk. "Matt," he answered simply, sticking to a version of his real name. Greg exhaled sharply. "All right, Matt, just keep your head down and don't get in the way. We got a lot to do." The first few hours were grueling. Cleaning office spaces wasn't new to him. He had once done this work himself when starting the company, but the pace was relentless. He noticed something quickly. The team was overworked. There weren't enough workers scheduled, and the ones here looked exhausted. A young woman named Rosa, barely in her 20s, scrubbed a breakroom counter with tired, shaky hands. She smiled weakly at him as he passed. "First day?" she asked. "Yeah," Matthew said. "You doing okay?" She hesitated, then nodded too quickly. "Yeah, just tired." Greg, the manager, stomped in. "Rosa, you're behind. Move faster." She flinched, grabbed her rag, and hurried to the next task. Matthew's jaw tightened, but he kept quiet. He needed to observe more before acting. Hours later, on a short break, he wandered into the small back room where employees kept their coats and bags. That's when he saw her Rosa, sitting on a plastic chair, her shoulders shaking. She was crying. Matthew froze. He wasn't supposed to intervene too soon, but something about this moment hit him hard. He cleared his throat. "Hey, you okay?" Rosa wiped her face quickly, looking embarrassed. Yeah, I'm fine. Just tired, you know." Matthew sat down across from her. "Looks like more than just tired." She hesitated before sighing. "It's just, Greg keeps cutting hours but expects us to do the same amount of work. I can't even make rent this month, and when I ask for more shifts, he just says I need to earn it." Matthew clenched his fists under the table. This wasn't just bad management, this was exploitation. Before he could respond, Greg's voice boomed from the hallway. "Break's over, get back to work." Rosa shot up, forcing a smile. "I gotta go." As she walked away, Matthew knew one thing for sure: this wasn't going to continue. The discovery. Matthew adjusted his grip on the mop, his mind racing. He had built this company from nothing. Spent years ensuring it had a reputation for fairness, for treating employees with dignity. And yet, here he was, watching his own workers being pushed to the breaking point. The night dragged on. The workload didn't let up. Offices needed to be cleaned, trash taken out, floors mopped, bathrooms sanitized. Rosa wasn't the only one struggling. An older man named Louis moved slowly, his knee clearly bothering him. Every time he lowered himself to scrub the baseboards, he winced. Another worker, Jamal, barely spoke. Just kept his head down, moving fast, sweat dripping from his temples. And then there was Greg. Greg didn't lift a finger. He barked orders, criticized the team for not moving fast enough, and disappeared into the break room for long stretches. Once, Matthew caught him scrolling through his phone, laughing at something, while Rosa hauled a heavy trash bag twice her size toward the service elevator. Matthew felt his stomach turn. He needed to see just how deep this went. A moment of truth. Near the end of the shift, Matthew found himself in the supply closet, restocking cleaning sprays. He overheard voices just outside the door, low, urgent. Greg's voice. Look, I don't care if you need more hours, Rosa. You want more shifts, you prove yourself first. Do some extra favors for me. Matthew froze. Rosa's voice was barely above a whisper. I just need the hours I was promised. Greg chuckled, then you know what to do. A silence. Matthew's hands curled into fists, his heart pounded. That was it. He couldn't just observe anymore. Pushing the door open hard, he stepped out. Greg's smug expression turned into a scowl. Rosa's face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. Matthew forced himself to stay calm. Everything okay here? Greg sneered. None of your business, rookie. Get back to work. Matthew stared him down for a long moment, then turned to Rosa. You all right? She nodded stiffly, avoiding Greg's glare. Matthew clenched his jaw. He knew she wouldn't say anything, not now, not with Greg standing right there. But he had seen enough. The final straw. By the time the shift ended, Matthew had one last thing to check. He needed to see the payroll records. He waited for the others to leave before slipping into the manager's office. The computer was still on. Payroll files were open. What he saw made his blood run cold. Greg had been skimming hours. Workers were being clocked out earlier than their real shifts ended. Overtime was erased. Bonuses that should have been paid out, never deposited. And Greg, he had given himself performance bonuses every month. Thousands of dollars. Matthew exhaled slowly. His hands trembled with rage. This wasn't just bad management. This was theft. Time to act. Matthew straightened up, his decision made. Tomorrow he would return. But not as Matt the new cleaner. Tomorrow he would return as the CEO. At the breaking point and reveal. Morning came fast, too fast. Matthew barely slept. His mind churned with everything he had seen, everything he had heard, the exhaustion in Rosa's voice, the quiet suffering of Louis, the stolen wages, and Greg, who strutted around like a king, ruling over people who had no choice but to put up with him. Not anymore. The return. He arrived at the office in his usual suit. No disguise, no mop, no thick-rimmed glasses. This time, he came as himself. The staff hadn't arrived yet, but Greg was there. Sipping coffee at his desk, scrolling through his phone, he didn't even look up. Yo, you're early. What do you need? Matthew didn't answer. He walked around the desk. Slow, deliberate, Greg finally glanced up and frowned. Wait, his eyes narrowed. You look familiar. Matthew pulled out his company ID, the one with his real name, his real title. Greg's face drained of color. Matthew Carter, he said, his voice calm, controlled, CEO of this company. Greg's mouth opened, then shut. He sat up straighter, the coffee cup shaking slightly in his hand. I don't understand. Matthew placed both hands on the desk. Leaning in, his voice was quiet, but firm. Oh, I think you do, Greg. Greg swallowed hard. Look, I don't know what. Matthew cut him off. I know about the stolen wages. A silence. I know about the erased overtime, the fake performance bonuses you paid yourself. His fingers curled against the desk. And I know about what you said to Rosa. Greg's face went pale. He started stammering. That's a misunderstanding, she. Matthew slammed his hand on the desk. Greg flinched. No more lies. Matthew's voice was steel. Everything I saw last night, that ends today. The confrontation. The employees started arriving. One by one, they walked in, stopping short when they saw Matthew standing in the center of the room. Rosa froze near the door, her eyes flicking between him and Greg. Louis and Jamal stood stiffly, unsure. Matthew turned to face them. "I know most of you don't know me," he said, his voice carrying through the space. "I'm Matthew Carter, the owner of this company. Last night, I worked alongside you. I saw everything." Murmurs rippled through the group. Rosa's hand went to her mouth. "I saw how hard you work, how much you sacrifice, and I saw how you've been treated." His jaw tightened, "and I won't allow it." Greg shot up from his chair. "Now, hold on just a damn minute." Matthew turned, eyes cold. "Sit down." Greg hesitated, then, slowly, dropped back into his chair. Matthew exhaled, looked at the employees. "Some of you have had your hours cut unfairly. Some of you have had your pay stolen. Some of you have been harassed." His gaze flickered to Rosa, who looked away, biting her lip. Greg shifted in his seat. "Matthew, listen." Matthew's voice was razor-sharp. "Mr. Carter, to you." Greg swallowed. Matthew straightened. "You're fired." Silence. "Then." "What?" Greg shot up again. "You can't just—" "I own this company," Matthew said, his voice low. "Dangerous. I built it and you—" He shook his head. "You've been bleeding it dry." Greg clenched his fists. His face was red now. "You have no proof." Matthew smiled. It wasn't a kind smile. "I have payroll records, I have security footage, and I have witnesses." He gestured to the employees. "You think they'll defend you?" Greg's mouth opened, then shut again. "Pack your things," Matthew said. "You're done." Greg stood there, chest rising and falling fast, his eyes darting around the room, but no one spoke up for him. Not Louis. Not Jamal. Not Rosa. Slowly, Greg grabbed his coffee cup, his hands shook. He turned and stormed out. The door slammed behind him. The aftermath. Silence hung in the air. Then, Rosa let out a breath she'd been holding, a shaky, disbelieving breath. Louis rubbed his face, muttering something in Spanish. Jamal just shook his head. Matthew turned back to them, his voice softened. "I should have seen this sooner, I should have known." He looked down for a moment, then back up. "But I promise you, things will change." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folder. "First, all stolen wages will be restored, every single cent." Louis's eyes widened. Rosa covered her mouth again, tears forming. "Second, no more unfair scheduling, no more intimidation, no more abuse." He looked at Rosa. "You never should have been put in that situation." She swallowed hard. "Thank you," her voice cracked. Matthew nodded. "A new manager will be brought in, someone who actually cares about this team." Jamal finally spoke. "Who?" Matthew smiled slightly. "I was thinking, Rosa." Everyone turned to her, her eyes widened. "Me." "You know the work, you care about the people, and after what you've been through," Matthew's expression softened, "I trust you." Tears spilled down Rosa's cheeks. She nodded, quickly, then more firmly. "I won't let you down." Matthew nodded. "I know." The realization. As the employees slowly absorbed everything, as relief settled into their faces, Matthew felt something shift inside him. He had built this company. But somewhere along the way, he had lost sight of what it meant to be in it. That would never happen again. He looked around at his team, his people. And he knew this was just the beginning. At the resolution. The room was still. The weight of everything that had just happened hung in the air. Greg was gone. For the first time in what felt like forever, the employees weren't looking over their shoulders, waiting for the next reprimand, the next insult, the next impossible demand. Matthew stood in front of them, hands in his pockets, eyes scanning their faces. Rosa, still wiping away tears. Louis, rubbing his knee, the exhaustion finally visible now that the tension had lifted. Jamal, arms crossed, skeptical but listening. This wasn't over. This was just the beginning. Fixing what was broken. Matthew exhaled slowly. "All right," he said, his voice steady. "Here's what's going to happen next." The employees straightened, waiting. First thing tomorrow, a full audit of payroll. His eyes locked onto each of them. Every hour stolen, every missing paycheck, every erased overtime entry will be restored. Louis let out a breath. Jamal nodded slightly. Rosa whispered, "Thank you." Matthew wasn't done. Second, no more understaffing. His voice was firm. "You've been doing the work of 2, 3 people at a time. That ends now. We'll be hiring new staff immediately." Jamal scoffed, shaking his head. "We've heard that before." Matthew met his gaze. "Not from me." Jamal held his stare for a moment, then gave a small nod. Matthew turned to Rosa. "I meant what I said. I want you to take over as manager." Her eyes widened again. I don't know if I can." "You already have," he said simply. "You've been leading this team without the title. Now you'll have the authority and the pay to match it." Tears welled in her eyes again, but this time, they weren't from fear or exhaustion. They were from hope. Making it right. Matthew spent the next few hours sitting with the employees, listening, really listening. The broken equipment, the missing supplies, the way Greg had threatened anyone who complained. He took notes, he asked questions, and he promised action. By the end of the day, a crew arrived to inspect the faulty cleaning machines. A hiring notice went out for new team members. And payroll. Matthew personally oversaw the corrections. When he handed Louis his corrected paycheck, when he saw the disbelief in the older man's eyes, when Louis gripped the check with shaking fingers and whispered, "I can finally pay my rent on time." Matthew knew. This was why he had started this company. Not for profits, not for expansion, but for people. A new beginning. Days passed, then weeks. The team grew, new employees joined, the workload became manageable. And Rosa. She stepped into her role with quiet strength. She made sure breaks were honored. She fought for her team. And when Matthew visited a promise he made to himself, to never be a distant CEO again, he watched as she helped Jamal clean a breakroom counter, joking with Louis about his retirement plans. The energy in the place was different. Lighter. Better. And when Rosa saw Matthew watching, she smiled. Not out of obligation. Not out of fear. But because, for the first time in a long time, she was happy. The final lesson. Matthew stood at the entrance, watching his team. His people. He had almost lost sight of them. Almost let the wrong people like Greg destroy what he had built. Never again. He turned to leave, but before he stepped out, Rosa called after him. "Mr. Carter." He turned, "Yeah." She hesitated, then said, "Thank you." Matthew smiled. "No," he shook his head, "thank you." And with that, he walked out. Not as a disconnected CEO. Not as a man blind to the struggles of his own company. But as a leader. A real one. And this time, he wouldn't forget it.